Tonight, we return to the medieval world, a place of whispered legends, miracle tales, and stories that seem too strange to believe. For centuries, many of these were dismissed as myth or superstition, until evidence proved otherwise. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden corners of history, I'd be glad to have you along, so think about subscribing and leaving a like. And in the comments, share where you're listening from and what time of day it is there. It's always fascinating to see this community stretching across so many places and hours. Now settle in, let the noise of the day fade away, and let's uncover the myths of the Middle Ages that turned out to be true. Imagine a monastery rising straight out of a swamp. No floating stones, no miracle, but the quiet force of human craft shaping land few dared to claim. Before we go on, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy wandering into history's calmer, stranger corners. Fenland monasteries and other builders of the Middle Ages solved the problems of water and mud with pilings, drains, and walkways. A monastery standing in the bog might look miraculous, yet it was engineering holding fast where the earth wanted to sink. And when archaeologists finally cut into fen soils, the traces told a different story. Picture monks setting heavy stones where only mud and reeds should stand. It sounds like the sort of miracle story whispered in sermons. Holy men walking into swampland and raising a shrine where no sane builder would choose to build. For centuries, that was exactly how the tale was told. A monastery in the flooded fen was taken as proof of divine favour as much as human labour. Yet to many scholars later on, such a claim seemed impossible. Could stone buildings really have been anchored in a land that barely supported its own surface? Now imagine stepping into that landscape yourself. The ground pulls at each step, boots sinking into black soil and stagnant pools. A veil of mist hangs low, so damp you can lose the outline of a man only a few paces away. The air clings to you, sour with the rot of reeds pressed into decay. Living here meant constant damp, mould rising on your walls, and the ground refusing to carry weight. To build here, stone upon stone, arch upon arch, seems almost unthinkable. The locals believed it had stood only by the will of heaven, the soggy earth firmed by prayer. Such stories carried weight in a time when every blight or cough was tied to unseen powers. For generations it was easy to accept that monks lived above the swamp because God had wished it. Tales of marvel mattered as much as facts. But with doubt, new explanations emerged. The abbey did not rise by miracle alone. It was rooted in skills and choices that made sense in their age. Why attempt such a feat at all? The marshes offered seclusion, turning away the world's noise and temptation. They also offered land at a price far lower than fertile ground. And to a monastic eye, the marginal place was not a hardship but a proving ground, where hardship mingled with holiness. What looked like folly to outsiders was, for these monks, an opportunity to build precisely where nature resisted. Archaeological work across Fenland sites and studies of medieval waterworks show how builders fought the swamp. Foundations were secured by driving wooden piles deep into soft earth until reaching firmer layers. Raised timber walkways, packed with clay and gravel, created firm roots across the marsh. Water was pulled away through drains and channels, carrying off stagnant pools. The same skills that allowed medieval towns to run wooden water pipes or plan public conduits also allowed monks to tame soggy earth. Their craft was not magic, but technique. Think of the foundations like stilts beneath a house on the shore, each beam designed to hold weight above what would otherwise swallow it. Those walkways acted like veins, carrying the flow of daily processions and labour across ground that would have engulfed bare feet. And the drainage systems, though simple, carried the orderliness of modern plumbing. Channels cut with intent, guiding excess away before it could rot wood or shift stone. Seen this way, the courage of the monks was not in claiming a miracle but in working at the edge of collapse. Soaked to the knees, driving posts into muck, laying each piece of timber as carefully as their prayers. The abbey rose because they carved science from experience, testing the ground, learning which methods kept it solid. In a world without pumps, they forced control from peat and water with hand tools and persistence. The miracle, if you call it that, came from their refusal to yield. The stench of rot, the threat of failure, the endless labour beneath dripping sky, none of it drove them off. They turned alien marshes into foundations strong enough for prayers to echo under stone vaults. No divine hand built the walls, but the work of theirs did something that looked every bit as wondrous to the people who gazed at it. And far from cheapening the legend, this makes it sharper. Worshippers knelt in cloisters that stood only because of hidden timber sunk into mud. Every stone was supported by work unseen, every hymn rested on beams buried below. Faith above, labour below. Both parts needed to coexist if the abbey was to stand. Seen through that lens, survival itself wore a holy mask. What matters is what that tells you about medieval builders. We picture them as men without science, but the order carved into marshes contradicts that. They managed drainage, they calculated loads, they applied patient engineering to ground that wanted to betray them. In scale, it rivals projects you might call modern. In spirit, it is the same calm act of problem-solving. So when you picture monks in sandals, imagine them not just chanting psalms but hauling clay and timber. Imagine smoke rising over stagnant water as hammers beat against posts in the half-light. The abbey became a sanctuary not because mud turned to stone by miracle, but because men worked until the swamp could be forced into service. Centuries later, the stone ruins you can still see carry only half the story. The rest remains underground, hidden in soil, silent but enduring. To stop here would be simple, but history rarely lets you rest with only one example of ingenuity. If a Fenland community could bury its genius under a cloak of miracle, then how many of the marvels we think we know were really stories laid over craft or even over nothing at all? Some legends began not in the ground but in the mouths of storytellers, repeated until they hardened into memory. And one of the most enduring of those names still walks with us today, cloaked in green and chased by sheriffs. What if the outlaw draped in green was never a single man, but a shifting mask for anger and hope? The figure we call Robin Hood stands between memory and invention, born in the voices of villagers and later reshaped by courts and storytellers. He lives less in the forest than in the echo of song, complaint, and the human need for justice wrapped in story. The legend stretches between two halves. First came the early outlaw ballads, rough, brutal, and unpolished. These songs did not describe a chivalrous knight or gentle rescuer. They told of ambushes, sudden violence, and mocking reversals of power. The sheriff who usually inspired fear was ridiculed, beaten, or overthrown for a moment in rhyme. Such tales sounded closer to tavern gossip than noble romance, but they carried something their listeners recognised: the frustrations of taxes, levies, and the weight of authority pressing down on common households. What matters is that these songs worked as release. Heavy rents stripped away hope. Local officials enforced dues with threats. To picture an outlaw clever enough, strong enough, to push back against that world gave listeners the brief taste of revenge. And one revealing detail that most Robin Hood films never show: the earliest verses rarely centred on giving money to the poor. Instead, they dwelt on mockery, rough punishment, and outlaw survival. For the audiences who first heard them, that was enough. As centuries passed, those rough tales no longer suited the cultural stage. Tudor England looked to the same figure, but needed something gentler, more useful to the monarchy. The violent rebel became a loyal trickster who fought only corrupt sheriffs, never the crown. Pageants and plays reshaped the archer into safe entertainment, dressing men in green for festivals, retelling his defiance as proof of order rather than rebellion. A figure who once threatened became a tool for unity. The outlaw softened into a national hero. Today's Robin is a palimpsest. His story layered and smoothed again and again. Each generation left its brushmark. The raw medieval ballads stressed punishment and survival. Tudor society polished him into a festival character who reassured rather than threatened. Later centuries added chivalry, courtly romance, and the noble Marion. By the time Victorians placed him in children's books, he was safe nostalgia, all gallant generosity with little of the earlier edge. When you imagine Robin now, you inherit all those layers together. Still, behind the changes lies something constant. Medieval records show variations of the name: Robehod, Hoberhod, Robinhod, attached not to one outlaw, but to fugitives, poachers, and petty criminals. It was more a label than a single life. Officials scratched it into legal roles to describe troublemakers hiding in woodland, avoiders of tax, or those who killed deer without permission. Over decades, the repetition of that nickname allowed the figure to take root in song. One mask collected the scraps of many. Why did such a mask endure? Because the grievances it carried were real. Families lived on the edge of ruin. at the mercy of fines or sudden failure of crops. To imagine someone turning the tables was irresistible. Tricksters and rebels often rise, in cultures where authority presses hardest. The Robin Hood of song was less a flesh-and-blood person than the shadow of resentment given form. If you wandered into a late medieval tavern, you might have seen it happen directly. Smoke rising, the sour edge of ale in the air, some voice striking up verses of a ballad in the common room. Hands rough with labour found joy in joining the refrain, while verse after verse mocked the sheriff. It mattered little if the outlaw was real. In that moment laughter tipped the scales. The tale acted as a reprieve, a moment where listeners could forget failure and debt. But legends never remain raw. As England grew more centralised, Robin was adjusted for different needs. He could keep the outline of rebellion, but be framed as loyal to rightful kings, never dangerous to the crown. That version reassured audiences that it was acceptable to cheer the rebel so long as his rebellion was narrow and safe. Ballads once born in defiance were staged as pageantry that nobles and clerics could watch without discomfort. Most historians treat the Robin Hood we know as a later legend, stitched together from scattered outlaw episodes and folk song. He is mostly literary invention, yet invention anchored in true grievance. The taxes, the harsh sheriffs, the fragile lives of peasants, these gave the story its root. That is why he persists. The details may shift, but the need for a figure who embodies resistance never vanishes. Think of Robin Hood less as a man and more as a mirror. To villagers, he was vengeance against officials who crushed them. To Tudor courts, he was colourful pageant. To Victorian publishers, he was a safe emblem of childhood adventure. For us, he floats as nostalgic rebel, a hero who reassures as much as he resists. Every era rewrote him, yet each preserved some faint outline of the anger that began it all. This dual nature explains his resilience. He is both real absence and enduring presence. No firm evidence of a historical outlaw named Robin Hood anchors him beyond the names in records. Yet the social forces that created him, anger at taxes, resentment at authority, longing for justice, are as real as any life. It is easier to remember a single archer than dozens of nameless villagers crushed by levies. A mask outlasts a crowd, and in that lies the paradox. Robin is mostly legend, yet the conditions that made him believable were no fiction. The stories softened, inverted, or embroidered him, but the pain they echoed was authentic. That blend of invention and truth is what allowed him to travel centuries. Each version built fresh meaning, while some echo of the first complaint lingered under every retelling. Now pause and consider how different Robin's story is from the kinds of groups that bound themselves to secrecy and vows. For him, survival depended on gossip and song, repeated aloud in public places. For others in medieval Europe, endurance came through silence, ritual and discipline, shutting out the world instead of winning laughter from it. Their strength lay not in legend, but in obedience to an order that demanded everything in a single night. Such oaths carried no cheer, only submission, and they led into stories even darker than outlaw song. Inside the temple's oath, the first step was not war or glory, but silence. Imagine arriving at the gates of a fortress monastery in the small hours before dawn. You came with no retinue, no weapons, and no name that mattered. Armour, sword, and inheritance had to be set aside. You entered empty-handed, stepping beneath torchlight into courtyards where each shadow felt weighted with expectation. From that moment, hesitation was forbidden. The Knights Templar have long been wrapped in rumour. People whispered of strange rites by candlelight, of secret knowledge, of men chanting into the dark. These stories outlived the order itself, painting them as occultists rather than soldiers. The reality was different. Their commitments were not hidden spells, but stark rules. Their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were real, enforceable, and absolute. Each vow cut deep. Poverty meant surrendering every possession, land, coin, inheritance, until nothing remained. Even your bed, your mantle, your place at table belonged only to the order. Chastity meant renouncing marriage and heirs, severing ties to women and family. Lineage, the pride of noble houses, was left behind. Obedience, perhaps most crushing of all, stripped away your will. You became subject to the voice of the master, ready to act without pause, whether in chapel or in battle. The ceremony testing these vows was austere. In the chapel, under bare stone and dim torchlight, the master asked whether the candidate entered freely, without debt, coercion, or obligation to another. Would he bind his life to this brotherhood? Each question pressed deeper. Did he owe money? Was he married? Did his family expect heirs? One false step ended the appeal. If he endured, the ritual moved forward. Before relics, a bone of a saint, a fragment of the cross, a worn gospel, the initiate swore aloud that he would live in poverty, chastity, and obedience until death. Each kiss upon relic or cross carried the weight of God's witness. There was no hidden drama, only the same gestures of devotion seen in countless monasteries, now sharpened to military severity. The investiture marked his transformation. Draped over his shoulders, the white mantle declared purity. It was simple wool, but it cut away his past as neatly as shears. Later the red cross would become emblematic, but on that first night, what mattered was the whiteness, a fabric signalling that a man now stood apart from worldly ties. When the mantle fell, he was no longer himself. He was property of the temple and Christ. No feast followed. His first meal matched the vow he had just taken. Plain bread, perhaps a little meat, thin wine, eaten in silence. Brothers watched with quiet recognition, each having once sat in the same place. No indulgence marked the occasion. The meal reinforced the truth. He had traded inheritance for discipline. It is worth pausing here on why these rules mattered. Poverty meant the order pooled resources. No knight owned wealth privately. Together they held collective strength far greater than any single lord. Chastity broke dynastic chains. No family ties could claim a Templar's loyalty, and obedience transformed them into a coherent force. Orders flowed down a chain, and men obeyed in unison. In an age of feudal quarrels, where lords bickered over rights and borders, the temple moved like one body across continents. This, more than sensational rumour, was the true source of their power. Outsiders searching for hidden. Ritual mistook the austerity itself as unnatural. How could noblemen willingly give up so much? To the townsman or courtier, it seemed easier to imagine forbidden rites than bare stone, silence and denial. Yet those rules forged an organisation that spanned Christendom and Outremer. Listen, if you enjoy glimpses into history's stranger corners, consider subscribing to this channel. These stories rest not in spectacle, but in the texture of lives remade by vows. What separated them from other monks was the sharpened edge of discipline. They prayed, yes, but they also rode into battle, obeyed commands, and submitted every choice to the order's rhythm. In chapel their chant was low and unadorned, carried in stone air. In the refectory their meals were ordered, silence held, portions rationed. Even their dress bore rules. No finery, no excess. Every detail of life was regulated so that the brotherhood moved as one. Think of it as a sculptor stripping stone. Each vow removed another piece of the self until only form remained, an outline of discipline sharpened and made uniform. To those outside, that strictness looked like secrecy. To those inside, it was the very reason they endured. Rumours clung, of course. People whispered that oaths spoken at night must hide darkness. But the truth was both simpler and harsher. No arcane symbols glowed in chapels, no demons were invoked. What happened within those walls was silence, repetition, kneeling, vows, relics. The world mistook austerity for mystery, when in fact the severity itself was hard enough to believe. If you stood at their table, you would see discipline at work in small details. A knight could not accept a gift without permission. He could not own private goods. Even his movements beyond the house required sanction. These rules strangled self-interest, pinning each man into place within the larger machinery. And paradoxically, such strictures gave the order freedom to operate across borders, unhampered by local ties or rival claims. Their opponents accused them of sorcery. But sorcery was less frightening than the truth. The order had learned how to erase the personal. A knight who has nothing to claim, nothing to love but obedience, fights with singular certainty. He lives with singular purpose. That unity outmatched castles and armies. Consider it plainly. Which is more daunting to endure, a one-night drama of candles and whispers, or a lifetime stripped of wealth, women, and will? the second bound tighter than any spell. That is why it worked. So when you picture the temple's oath, erase the visions of cloaked magicians. Picture instead a man kneeling, his inheritance gone, his cloak replaced, his lips pressed to bone or wood believed to be holy. Picture silence stretched until the vow was spoken. That scene explains more of their rise than any legend of secrets. Whispers of blasphemy and heresy may have disguised unease, but what truly unsettled outsiders was the notion that someone might live with such surrender. Better, perhaps, to imagine forbidden rites than absolute obedience. Yet history leaves the record clear. The Templars' strength grew from silence, sacrifice, and surrender. And still, even the strongest discipline could not guard against the ambitions of kings. The mantle, the relics, the vows, none of it shielded them when power turned upon them. Soon, a dawn would come when obedience itself became a trap, and the date attached to that morning still unsettles us even now. The weight of Friday the 13th does not lie in ladders, black cats, or broken mirrors. It begins with a morning when soldiers moved in silence across France, waiting for a signal that would turn prayer into panic. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, the order of the Knights Templar was struck down in a coordinated assault. At the command of King Philip IV, doors were forced open in towns, castles, and monasteries. At dawn, hundreds of Templars were seized. This was no act of fate, no unlucky chance. It was a carefully timed plan, carried out across a realm in one sweep. The men expected a day of ritual and routine. Instead, they were woken under threat of steel. Cloaks were torn away, wrists bound, possessions seized. One detail matters most. It happened everywhere at once. From Paris to the provinces, the knock of armed men shattered an order built on obedience. For an organisation sustained by vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, the shock was absolute. The discipline that had bound them could not defend against coordinated strike. Obedient men waited for instruction, and in that hesitation the king's officers dictated their fate. The motives behind this act were no mystery. Philip's treasury was strained. He owed vast sums to the Templars, whose financial networks reached across Europe. Their land holdings, their ability to store and move wealth, and their reputation as an independent power made them both rival and creditor. By breaking them, Philip could both cancel his debts and lay hands on their assets. To ordinary eyes, this was royal justice. In truth, it was calculated confiscation. But confiscation alone would not be enough. A king could not simply rob an order entrusted with Christendom's defence. So charges were invented. Tales spread of heresy, of men spitting on the cross, of worship before a strange bearded head. These accusations were not whispered privately. They were trumpeted as reasons for the roundup. While the details varied, the effect was the same. Fear sharpened public opinion. Confession, though, had to be manufactured. Torture saw to that. Men broken on the rack or crushed in cells spoke words their captors desired. Those words were gathered as evidence, voiced in trials held before officials eager to please the crown. Soon the narrative bent to the king's design. The Templars were guilty, France was safe, the wealth of the order rested in his hands. If you enjoy journeys into this kind of history, moments where myth bends into politics, consider subscribing. It helps keep us exploring these quieter, darker corners together. Imagine the halls left behind after that morning. Chests broken open, manuscripts missing from shelves, relics carried away under guard. The discipline once visible in their cloisters vanished. The men who had lived as warriors of Christ were reduced to prisoners, carried to cold cells with their hair shorn and mantles stripped away. This, more than any superstition, is the truth of that Friday. For the Templars, it was not the number 13 that destroyed them. It was the greed of a king and the compliance of a pope. The day's shadow only darkened later, when storytellers looked back and gave cosmic meaning to calculated betrayal. Historians now stress this point firmly. The unlucky reputation of Friday the 13th did not exist in 1307, it developed afterwards. Popular imagination stitched the date and the day into an omen, reinterpreting the fall of the Templars as though heaven itself had marked out their fate. The truth is simpler, harsher. Politics at work disguised as providence. There is an irony in this legend's survival. A brotherhood bound by vows of poverty and obedience was undone not by spiritual failure, but by one monarch's debt ledger. Yet memory prefers a curse to a balance sheet. It is easier to speak of an unlucky calendar than to face the plain mechanics of power and greed. The persecution did not end with arrests. Trials dragged on for years, each staged with solemn theatre. Pope Clement V, at first cautious, bowed at last to Philip's will. By 1312, papal decrees formally dissolved the Templars. Their lands and houses shifted to others. Their name was stricken from records, and in 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned alive in Paris. Chroniclers later claimed he cursed both king and pope, as though his death carried prophetic fire. Yet even that moment was framed in human terms. No curse toppled rulers. Both men died within the year, but from causes natural and ordinary for an age of ill health. The legend grew because storytellers wanted symmetry, not because fate bent the thread. What made sense to contemporaries was less magic and more inevitability. Kings feared rivals, debts pressed heavy, obedience proved a liability, not a defence. The mark of Friday the 13th persists because memory reshaped it. We hesitate when seeing the date not because soldiers move across our streets, but because centuries of retelling have loaded it with vague unease. A superstition blossomed where once there was only an active state. What matters is the shadow such stories cast. The raid of 1307 was not caused by the day itself. It was not ill luck. It was deliberate, timed, orchestrated. But like a shadow, the superstition stretched away from it, bending the body of truth into something stranger and harder to recognize. We remember the shadow more than the shape. When you pause on a calendar square marked 13, think instead of those iron gates swinging open, those prayers cut short, those men bound in silence. Their vows of poverty and chastity did not save them. Their obedience had made them strong, but it also left them helpless when that obedience bound them under chains rather than under Christ. The irony is sharp. Their greatest strength was also their undoing. This is what Friday the 13th carries beneath the superstition. Not ladders or mirrors, not the accident of chance, but the echo of power cutting through cloisters. A date that speaks of human ambition dressed up in the costume of cosmic fate. Strip away the superstition, and you find one king's debts, one pope's hesitation, and an order reduced to ashes. Still, fear clings to dates as much as to places. People shape trauma into patterns they can recognize, even when the cause was flesh and politics, not spirits. And in the years that followed, not all collective terrors arose from crowns or calendars. Sometimes an entire community was seized by something even stranger, when unease did not sit quietly, but moved through bodies in motion, pressing them into rhythms they could not stop. Strasbourg in 1518 woke to a spectacle that confounded sense. The summer air shimmered in the narrow streets, and in the city square bodies moved without pause. They staggered, swayed, and stamped their feet until their knees buckled. When they fell, they rose again, as if pulled upright by something stronger than exhaustion. This was no feast, no wedding, and no sanctioned festival. It was an outbreak. It began with one woman, Frau Trophea, stepping into the street and moving to a rhythm no one else could hear. Neighbours observed her uneasily, expecting the strange convulsion to end. Instead, it spread. Within days, dozens joined her. Within a week, the count ran into the hundreds. They did not move with joy, and they did not choose their steps. Their faces were blank, their limbs both rigid and fluid. Socks and shoes slapped against stone, skirts clung with sweat. The movement was relentless. City records preserved the alarm. Clerks wrote of men and women collapsing and then rising again the moment they could stand. Crowds gathered, uneasy, because rest provided no release. Even when carried to beds, the afflicted were said to slip back into rhythm and return to the streets. Strasbourg became defined by this sound. Dozens, then hundreds, stamping hour after hour across flagstones that usually held merchants and councilmen. What caused it? Modern explanations fall into two camps. One points to the bread of the region, rye sometimes poisoned by ergot fungus. This mould can produce convulsions, hallucinations, and erratic behaviour. The stomach takes in a loaf of bread, and by dawn the body spasms under alien command. Ergot poisoning is verified elsewhere. It provides an unnerving answer, food turned against the body, but the numbers resist. Could a household mould cause whole crowds to writhe together in a public square? The alternative camp argues mass psychogenic illness, a communal outbreak of the body reflecting shared stress. Famine haunted memory. Plague had ravaged the region within living recollection. To see one neighbour moving in torment might trigger the mind of another, and then another, until the spectacle spread like flame leaping roof to roof. Each person caught became both patient and cause. Neither theory closes the case. Both carry weight. Neither explains every detail. In any crowd scene, the explanation feels plausible. Someone faints at worship, and soon others follow. The body sometimes echoes what the mind fears. In Strasbourg, the pressures were heavy enough that the echo may have become endless. This is why the phenomenon unsettles. Food might have poisoned some. Fear might have poisoned others. We cannot decide with certainty which was the greater cause. The authorities failed to halt it. Doctors told the council that forcing the dancers to keep moving might purge the sickness. So musicians were hired, drums and fiddles arranged to carry the crowd into exhaustion. The step was not malice, but medicine that misplaced its mark. Many believed that illness could be expelled through excess. The effect was the opposite. The music lent form to the frenzy. The stage built by the city did not restore order, but made the square into theatre of misery. Noise filled Strasbourg. Day blurred into night as the sound of heels and instruments became constant. Exhausted relatives dragged family members aside only to see them return again. Outsiders viewed it as punishment, perhaps divine, while councilmen watched tax-paying citizens collapse. Within weeks the city seemed smothered by rhythm. Worship and commerce paused, overshadowed by weary limbs jerking against their own limits. Death followed inevitably. To move without pause for hours, then days, stripped the body's reserves. Accounts describe sudden fainting, vomiting, feet bloodied from stone, hearts giving out mid-step. Carts bore bodies away even as the crowd around them continued. Officials alternated shrines and physicians, prayers and decrees, yet none of it slowed the tide. Only after months did the movement fade, the last dancers sinking into silence. Later generations studied the event with fascination. Chroniclers wrote of punishment from God. Clerics hinted at devils. The modern mind reaches for poison and psychology. Each explanation carries plausibility, but breaks against some part of what was witnessed. Bred fungus produces convulsion, but not crowd. Panic spreads among groups, but rarely holds on for months. Questions remain, and unease rests in the space between. And this matters. The outbreak was real. It is not a story crafted centuries later to amuse travellers. Strasbourg's council registers, church logs, and letters fix it in ink. They measured, they paid musicians, they sent supplicants to shrines. Ordinary officials documented not allegory but event. This is why the image lingers. History confronts us with a reality stranger than the myths it inspired. Think of the scene as evidence rather than metaphor. Cobblestones worn smoother by pounding feet. The sour odour of sweat rising in heat. The look of neighbours who recognise that what grips one person may soon grip them all. The memory of hunger and plague amplifying every fear. These details remind us the dancing plague sits between the categories we prefer, neither clear science nor comfortable legend. Tonight, we look back on this outbreak not as miracle or myth, but as a collision of body and belief. Some medieval marvels were exaggerations, some were satire turned rumour, but a few were painfully physically real. The dancing plague of 1518 proves that the line between fiction and fact was not always where we expect it. The boundary blurred on Strasbourg's streets, reminding us that the past holds both invention and event. And when rumours pressed against authority, the stories sometimes reached even higher corridors. Strange chronicles whispered that power itself might have been unsettled at the very top, that the figure dressed in robes of the papacy could have concealed an identity no one admitted aloud. Could a woman have sat on the papal throne? In the Middle Ages, this question flickered like a rumour that refused to die. The story of Pope Joan describes a woman who dressed as a man, rose through the clerical ranks and wore the triple crown, and when her secret was exposed, the tale insists, the revelation was catastrophic. What matters most is not whether she truly existed, but that the legend persisted, half denied, half believed, shaping European imagination for centuries. The official papal lists never record her name. Instead, her story emerges clearly only in the 13th century, centuries after the time she supposedly ruled. Chronicles from that era began to describe her in detail: a learned cleric concealing her sex, a pope who reigned in disguise, and a downfall when her body betrayed her during a public procession. These accounts gave shape to the legend, even if they did not anchor it firmly in earlier history. Once captured in ink, Joan's image remained impossible to shake. Earlier hints do exist, though faint and uncertain. An 11th century chronicle leaves some ambiguity in the sequence between two popes. The text never speaks of a woman, but the silence created a gap, and later writers filled it with story. Some medieval chronicles include anomalies and spaces like this, which later generations reshaped into the Joan tale. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Where record faltered, imagination stepped in. That is how the shadow of Joan grew. By the 13th century, the legend settled into its lasting form. Writers described her disguise and rise, but also her downfall, most often during a grand procession when childbirth gripped her body in the street. The scene was lurid, a tableau of robes torn, crowds horrified, authority ruined in an instant. For medieval moralists, it fit a familiar structure: deception punished, pride brought low, hidden truth exposed for all to see. A story like that needed no proof. Its moral resonance kept it alive. Set this tale against its backdrop. Christendom was fractured by suspicion of Rome, dispute over authority, and unease about corruption. In such a climate, the tale of Pope Joan was more than a scandal. It held up a mirror to doubt. Could the seat of St. Peter itself be tricked? Could gender upend the borders that seemed immovable? To many listeners, her story carried both dread and fascination. It spoke to anxieties about power, gender, and the fragility of institutions that claimed eternity. Even papal rituals seemed to reflect the unease. A ceremonial throne known as the sedia, carved with a hollow seat, became attached to her legend. Later readers imagined that new popes were tested on this chair, their sex confirmed before enthronement to prevent another Joan. But historians now see this as a later symbolic reading, not a medieval device of verification. Still, once whispered, the connection refused to fade. A chair so oddly shaped invited meaning. It was enough for audiences already inclined to believe. Visual culture added more fuel. Manuscript images, later paintings, and even tarot decks depicted female popes, often titled the papess. Whether these figures represented Joan herself or symbolic wisdom is unclear. The ambiguity proved fertile. A crowned woman in papal posture could be scandal remembered or allegory intended. For any viewer, the image confirmed whichever story they had already chosen to believe, and so the legend lingered not through fact, but through symbols that invited people to project their fears and fascinations. Historians remain divided even now. Some see the story as satire sharpened to mock the arrogance of papal power. Others note how scribes sometimes inflated an anomaly into a marvel, crafting stories from gaps in record for entertainment or instruction. Still others suggest dim memories of some scandal, a disguised cleric, a contested succession, that later blossomed into complete fiction. But all agree on this: the evidence cannot be resolved. Joan resists both confirmation and erasure. That refusal shapes her. Endurance. If papal records had flatly denied her existence, belief might have withered. If reliable chronicles had preserved her reign, she would stand as history, not rumour. Instead, her presence in sources sits uneasily between. That middle space is fertile soil for myth. Too vivid to dismiss, too doubtful to prove, Pope Joan lives in the margins, and the margins keep her alive. Her power rests not in reality, but in what she represented. She crystallizes the unease of a structure built on male dominance. If a woman could ascend, even in disguise, then the whole edifice appeared less certain than claimed. To some, her story mocked Rome's pretense of perfection. To others, it warned of corruption and moral failure. One story, two readings, satire for critics, sermon for believers. That dual life explains why the tale travelled so widely. Picture it again, not as fact, but as narrative. A procession winds through Rome, hymns rising in the summer air, the Pope robed in splendour before adoring crowds. Then the disguise cracks. Labour overtakes the figure on horseback, the body refusing control, the secret exposed to every eye. It is a scene built for theatre, shocking enough to unsettle the faithful, entertaining enough to delight the sceptical. Behind polished authority, flesh gave way, and that image eroded the aura of invulnerability the papacy sought to project. Even the ritual of the hollow seat, read as gender-checking device, belongs in the same vein. A throne meant to exalt instead hints at fragility. Whatever its real origin, once coupled to the Joan story, it reinforced the claim that power must always guard against betrayal from within. The tale stripped away solemnity and revealed unease. Authority might look eternal, but beneath it sat fear. That disguise could twist the order of things. And so, the legend endured not by record but by need. Joan became a figure by which communities tested their doubts about authority. She was satire, scandal, or warning depending on who invoked her. She proved how imagination took root where evidence faltered. Myths like hers are not discarded because their detail is wrong. They survive because they capture recurring fear. If you enjoy stepping through these stranger passages of memory, consider subscribing. It helps us keep wandering into history's half-lit corners together. Think about the deeper lesson here. When a community spins a legend, it usually reveals more about its fears than about its facts. A female pope, whether living person or invention, embodied the possibility that the church's most absolute structures could be broken open. People repeated her story not because they had proof, but because the story allowed them to explore forbidden thought. Once such a figure appeared in memory, she could not be excised. Her legacy shows fiction's force. A tale does not need proof to endure, it needs resonance. Pope Joan resonated because she unsettled. She blurred the boundary between sacred office and fallible body, between eternal throne and human disguise. That tension, between the strength of Rome and the frailty beneath, kept her alive in whispers, art, ritual, and chronicles. The neatness of her downfall, disguise exposed at the height of a procession, feels more like pointed allegory than sober record. Its very vividness betrays its artifice. Yet that same vividness ensures its survival. Narratives that satisfy both dread and curiosity are the hardest to erase. Pope Joan remains a shadow because she speaks less of whether a woman ever ruled in Rome, and more of how power is doubted, mocked, or feared. She reveals the fault lines beneath certainty. She shows that myths endure not for what they prove, but for what questions they allow us to ask. And suspicion did not only turn against thrones and crowns. It reached into streets and barns, into markets and homes, reshaping how judgment was imagined in daily life. There were moments when accusations and trials did not stop with people at all, but extended even further into the creatures that lived alongside them. What if a pig could stand trial for murder? To modern ears it sounds absurd, a grim fable or a carnival trick, but in late medieval Europe it was taken very seriously. The same courts that tried thieves or killers sometimes summoned animals into the dock. The logic was not casual. Many believed animals could be part of the same moral order as humans, capable in some way of guilt. To us, the image of a judge reading charges to a sow is grotesque parody. To them, it reinforced law in a world always on the edge of disruption. Picture the Hall of Justice in 15th century France. The room smells of damp wood and straw. A small crowd presses close, neighbours, clerics, civic officers. At the centre waits the accused, a large sow, chained, penned inside the hall. She shifts uneasily, foam flecking her mouth as onlookers mutter to each other in hushed tones. The place feels unsettled. What should be a comedy has become ritual. This is the trial of Savigny's sow, 1457. The case was grave enough. A 5-year-old child had been killed in the street, mauled in full view of witnesses. In response, the court treated the crime with exact procedure. The animal was seized, locked in a cell, and boarded at the expense of the town. Records survive showing the jailer was paid his standard fee, the same as if she were a regular inmate. A lawyer was formally appointed to speak on her behalf. The paperwork of guilt and defence stacked up line by line, as though the accused could follow every word. Now, imagine the hearing itself. The judge seated at the bench, clerks waiting with pens, prosecutors prepared to recount the horror in detail. They spoke of the child, of the attack itself, of blood traces. On the other side, the appointed lawyer argued circumstance. Could intent be proven? Could an animal know what it did? As strange as that seems, these questions mattered within a framework that extended moral agency beyond humankind. The sow stood accused, with the same solemn process as any felon of the town. The verdict came decisively. Guilty, sentenced to hang. The punishment was not carried out in secret but in public spectacle. A hangman, contracted as for human executions, performed the task. The sow was strung by her hind legs on the gallows before a watching crowd. To the community, this was justice made visible. The law showed itself strong enough even to reach into barnyards. There was, however, a second question. 6 piglets, the sow's offspring, were also seized. They too had been touched with blood and so stood accused as accomplices. The court debated their fate in careful terms. Were they also guilty, or had they simply been present? In the end, they were acquitted. Bloodstains proved nothing beyond contact. Here is the detail that strikes modern readers most. Amidst the grotesque setting of an animal trial, procedure was still applied. Evidence had to be weighed. Reason was observed. The sow was condemned. Her young survived. Why would a community stage such a ritual? Medieval reasoning offers an answer. Animals, like humans, were seen within the moral fabric of creation. If they caused harm, they broke order and had to be judged. Both secular and ecclesiastical courts took these cases with the same energy they gave to human crime. Lawyers, judges, jailers, hangmen, all played their parts. In their eyes, justice was whole only if it ran through every level of existence. To leave a child's death unanswered was dangerous. To try the pig was to reassure the living. It is tempting to see only cruelty. Yet for those present, the trial had a social role. It reassured families that evil did not go unanswered. When the guilty fell from the gallows, even a beast, the community felt that order had been restored, loss made less senseless. The execution acted as closure for grieving relatives. It was theatre, yes, but theatre aimed at healing. Nor was Savigny exceptional. Records of animal trials appear across Europe. Swine, dogs, horses, goats and birds. Even insects found themselves before ecclesiastical courts. If rats devoured crops, they might be summoned by writ. If weevils spread through granaries, lawyers could be appointed to defend them. In one case, the trial was dismissed only because the insects failed to appear. The process was absurd to us, but serious then. It was another way of tying the natural world into a structure of accountability. The symbolism cut deep. To punish animals publicly was a way of saying that violence never stood outside the law. A harbour thief, a restless neighbour, or even a pig in the sty would face the same order. Communities steeped in famine, plague, or war longed for signs that rules still held. Trials of beasts became symbolic affirmations. Each case stretched justice beyond the human, but in doing so, reminded all listeners that no one and nothing lay outside the reach of judgment. Sometimes these dramas were heightened by small rituals, an animal dressed in human clothing or scarred by the executioner before death. Such gestures made the punishment mirror human correction. But beyond the spectacle, the meaning was clear. A visible punishment told the village that law had spoken. Disorder was checked. The world was stable for another day. Still, note the peculiar balance within the process. The same legal system that condemned a sow consulted carefully over her piglets. The apparatus of defence was extended to speechless animals. As bizarre as it appears, it reveals a genuine commitment to consistency. Justice had to be seen to act fairly, even when the case involved livestock. To abandon formality would be to weaken law itself. For the communities that held these trials, procedure mattered at least as much as outcome. The image of a sow hanged for homicide may strike us as emblematic of superstition. Yet the underlying motive was sober. People needed visible justice against chaos. They needed closure after sudden bloodshed. They needed to believe that order ran through every fibre of life. And so they looked not only to the pulpit but to the courthouse, not only to scripture but to sentence, to fill the gaps left by violence. Cases multiplied, not only pigs that attacked, but cattle that gored, horses that trampled, even small creatures that damaged fields. Ecclesiastical judges sometimes excommunicated rats or locusts, driving them from crops with solemn curses. The act was legal performance, but also pastoral reassurance. It taught that law and faith together could respond to disasters otherwise unmanageable. Where reason faltered, symbol spoke. For us, the idea of suing weevils or convicting pigs is hard to read as anything but parody. But medieval minds did not treat it so. To bring creatures before judgment was to declare that justice applied from king to insect, from noble to sow. In that vision, order embraced all of creation. To pretend otherwise was to risk chaos, demonic influence, or despair. Justice had to be seen everywhere, even where reason strained. So what can we take from this? These trials were less about granting true guilt to animals than about remaking human certainty. When a pig swung from gallows, what was really hanging was disorder itself. The public act was reassurance, a sermon in action. If you stood watching, you would have taken home not just the sight of an animal dead, but the sense of balance restored. When we look back at this strangeness, we see both theatre and need. To strip power from chaos, societies turned even to livestock and insects. They clothed justice in ritual, because ritual gave shape to fear. The Savigny trial and many like it show that medieval culture bound law to every layer of life. From beasts in the sty to humans in the square, everything was caught in that net. And as unsettling as it feels to us, the impulse is human. When faced with disruption, people prefer judgment to silence. They prefer visible punishment, however illogical, to unanswered loss. Trials of animals speak less to animal agency than to human anxiety, the constant desire to know that order prevails. That perspective is worth keeping in mind because it touches on how medieval culture imagined the largest frameworks of all. If they could place swine beneath law, what did they believe about where law, land and creation itself began or ended? What shape did they believe the world held under heaven? Its edges, its horizon, its fate? The answer lies not in absurdity, but in how they pictured the very ground beneath their feet. Did the Middle Ages really think the earth was flat? The question lingers in classrooms, films and popular imagination, sailors trembling at the thought they might fall into the abyss if they strayed too far from shore. That picture is neat. It sets the medieval world as ignorant, waiting for bold explorers or enlightened ages to correct it. But the truth is different. Scholars of the time worked with a globe, not a platter. The claim of flatness came centuries later, invented to cast a shadow backward. When you picture a monk in candlelight, bent over parchment, or a university teacher lecturing in a stone hall, the text before them spoke of a sphere. Their shelves carried classical authors, Aristotle on physics, Ptolemy on astronomy, and none of these taught flatness. The idea that the earth was round was accepted by educated clergy and scholars with unusual consistency. To them it was fact. Roundness needed demonstration, not debate. How did they prove such a thing? The standard textbook of medieval astronomy, John Sacrobosco's Tractatus de Sphera, offered calm, practical demonstrations. It asked why stars rose and set at different times depending on where you stood. It pointed out that at sea the mast of a ship appears first, while the hull emerges only as it nears, evidence of curvature. For students in Paris, Bologna, Oxford or Prague, this was the normal lesson. The earth was spherical, suspended in the heavens, moving as part of the wider cosmos. This knowledge was not limited to high medieval universities. Isidore of Seville, writing centuries earlier, already called the earth a sphere within the heavens. He described the inhabited world as an orbis, a circle of human lands, but his meaning applied to one hemisphere, not to a cosmic flat map. The larger earth remained round, like the ball or apple to which poets often compared it. That imagery filtered out widely, appearing in poems, romances and vernacular writings. A peasant could hear it in sermons, a lay reader could encounter it in stories. Scholars and many educated writers knew the earth was round. Popular literature and travel tales assumed it. Yet the myth of the flat earth took root later, not from medieval voices but from 19th century writers. They wanted to contrast their modern enlightenment against a supposedly ignorant past. The most famous was Washington Irving, whose embellished biography of Christopher Columbus imagined him fighting clerics who thought he might fall off the edge. In truth, Columbus debated distance, not shape. But Irving's tale stuck, feeding the modern picture of flat, earth, medieval minds. The 19th century invention of dramatic flat earth stories dressed as conflict with the church created a convenient fiction. But what about those who lived outside the cloister or university? Did ordinary people hear these ideas? The evidence suggests they did. French romances such as Le Couronnement de Louis casually describe journeys that circled the earth. In Norse literature, the King's Mirror explained sunlight and shadow, with examples that only make sense if the world curves. In The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, sailors return home by voyaging west into the east. The tale made sense only because readers already accepted a globe beneath their feet. These works did not argue for roundness, they assumed it. So while we cannot measure the depth of common belief, we can say the notion of a sphere reached beyond classrooms. Of course, there was debate. Scholars and theologians questioned not whether the earth curved, but whether human life might exist across it. The discussion of the antipodes occupied many treatises. Could men live on the opposite side of the earth? Was the equatorial zone too hot to cross, forever cutting north from south? For some Christian writers, Scripture seemed to forbid another branch of humanity hidden across an impassable desert of heat. If Adam's descendants were rooted in the north, no one could appear beyond. But note the terms of the question. It was not, is Earth flat? It was, who lives on the other side? The sphericity itself was granted. The persistence of the flat Earth myth says more about modern storytelling than about medieval learning. It comforts us to think of history as steady progress from mistake into truth. Darkness yields to light. The narrative is clean, yet in this case the Middle Ages preserved far more continuity than the caricature allows. They built their cosmology on inherited standards, tested those standards in teaching and observation, and left a body of work on which later scholars gently pulled. The round earth was never lost. Think of knowledge here as a loom. Antiquity stretched the warp with Aristotle and Ptolemy. The Middle Ages did not cut those threads. They wove new strands through, adding colour but keeping the same form. Later centuries did not rescue truth from darkness. They worked with a fabric already intact. The image of flatness came from later projection, not from medieval practice. Still, the story of flat Earth endures because it entertains us. It casts earlier people as fearful and limited, while flattering us as enlightened. Films, novels, and textbooks once repeated it because it told a simple arc. The problem is that simplicity distorts. The medieval student sketching diagrams already accepted that horizons curved, that shadows shifted, that vessels vanished hull first. Few of them ever muttered about an edge of the world. They considered such a claim childish, and outside classrooms echoes of this certainty appeared everywhere. Poems compared Earth to an apple. Travellers' tales placed men circling from east to west. Norse explanations of sunlight assumed curvature with ease. We cannot swear that every farmer in a field grasped the logic of Sacrobosco, but the outlines of spherical Earth filtered through language and image until they became cultural habit. Enough so that when tales described circumnavigation, audiences read with familiarity instead of shock. There is a quiet irony here. Because modern imagination could not picture medieval commoners engaging with globes, we supplied ignorance in their place. In doing so, we cut away evidence of continuity, making a desert where there was none. By drawing a false horizon of flat Earth darkness, later writers marked an edge that never existed. So when you come across a claim that Columbus proved what monks denied, remember this: the scene was invented. The round Earth was already fact to his judges. The distance across the sea was in question, not the risk of tumbling into the air. The flat Earth myth comforts our sense of progress, but it is echo more than record. The truth is quieter, and in a way, darker. The Middle Ages did not live in dread of edges. They lived within a cosmos they thought ordered, layered with spheres from Earth to moon to sun and stars. By carrying ancient learning forward, they preserved not superstition, but practical continuity. Their minds were capable of engineering marsh foundations, binding themselves under vows, speculating on the antipodes, proof that the so-called darkness was often a shadow cast by later authors, not by reality itself. The medieval mind was not flat. It was curved, structured, and full of continuity. It accepted Earth as a globe turning beneath the heavens. Myths of ignorance obscure that more unsettling truth, that the Middle Ages were not a void but an era of thought, craft, and order. In fact, the ways we picture them now, imagining flat maps, dark ignorance, bare stone walls, often tell us more about our own beliefs than theirs, and in that lies the perfect bridge. Because if our vision of the earth they stood upon has been rendered flatter than their own, then it is no surprise that the buildings they raised have also been stripped in our minds of something they once held, not shape this time, but colour. Step into a medieval cathedral, and what would have greeted you was not bare stone, but a world alive with paint. The walls, the sculptures, even the gargoyles were drenched in colour, turning the building into something closer to theatre than pure stonework. Modern eyes expect solemn grey, but medieval faith offered spectacle that pressed upon the senses at every turn. Imagine the inauguration of a great cathedral. Crowds gather tight, incense drifts thick. Everywhere you look, colour takes hold. Robes of saints painted with deep reds and gold, ceilings glowing blue and scattered with stars, angels dressed with touches of white and red across their wings. The entire space shimmered, each figure painted to catch attention. To enter was to leave behind the streets and be swallowed into saturated splendour. The exteriors were no less striking. Statues on facades that now look pale as bone once wore living hues. Blues, greens, crimsons brushed onto cloaks and armour, even flesh tones rubbed into stone so faces appeared warm and lifelike. The facade of Reims Cathedral shows this best. Laser mapping and digital projection, based on tiny paint traces still lodged in its pores, now reveal how those saints looked 6 centuries ago. Robes emerald, wings golden, faces flushed with colour. What appears noble and bare to us was meant to dazzle from the very start. Inside, the world only grew more intense. A virgin's robe of deep ultramarine radiated sanctity, while martyrs blazed in scarlet. Gold leaf flashed under flickering candlelight, enlarging the sense of the divine. Across the aisles, frescoes told stories loud in colour. Demons smeared in black, saints rising in radiant green, angels rimmed with yellow light. Tapestries hung close, woven with vermilions and greens so strong they strained the eye. Together, stone and colour formed a complete immersion. Prayer unfolded within a visual script designed as much for the unlettered as the scholar. Each shade carried coded meaning. Red meant suffering and sacrifice. Blue signalled holiness and heavenly grace. White stood for purity, and gold proclaimed eternity and the weight of heaven. For a farmer who could not follow Latin scripture, these meanings were as legible as words. To step through the doors meant entering not only a space of prayer, but a field of colour representing doctrine, legend and promise. The church carried theology in pigment as much as in parchment. Even gargoyles played their part. You know their grim stone faces now, but in the 15th century you would have seen them striped with ochre, bright eyes rimmed green, teeth painted chalk white. Monsters looked back down from rooftops, not in shadows, but in carnival colours that startled as much as they warned. The grotesque, turned vivid, was meant to remind, amuse, and warn all at once. The artistry that produced such visions depended on a careful craft. Pigments were ground from minerals like azurite and malachite, or from roots and plants like madder. Egg yolk or oils served as binders. Teams of painters climbed scaffolds, covering massive surfaces, carving stories in line while others layered on shades. Each stroke was meant to last, and many did. Tiny flecks remain locked in crevices even today, just enough for archaeologists and restorers to reconstruct the schemes with technology. In their survival, we witness the brilliance that once drenched entire walls and towers. But you might ask, if these cathedrals blazed with such colour, what happened to it? The answer lies in time, rain-washed pigments, sunlight-bleached faces, costs mounted and maintenance faded. Repainting had been part of normal upkeep, but as centuries passed, money for constant renewal lessened. New tastes emerged, preferring plainer settings that seemed dignified, and so, layer by layer, a riot of colour dimmed to what we now see. The silence of stone is less a truth than the echo left when brightness finally gave way. Think of walking into one of these cathedrals at its height. The sound of chant pounded through the arches, incense clogged the air around you, and every surface glittered or glowed with paint. Ceiling stars gleamed. Frescoes burst with drama. Painted statues leaned overhead. The combination was meant to overwhelm, to implant awe, to give a vision of heaven transposed into this world. For a medieval congregation, this was holiness, saturation to the point of trembling. That experience runs against modern instincts. We prize restraint. We associate faith with quiet tones and bare halls of light. Yet medieval faith meant splendour that assaulted every sense. Colour was not an accident. It was the medium of meaning. To worship in a stripped-down void would have seemed wrong, even unfinished. For them, a cathedral without paint would have been like a hymn sung without sound. Over time the vision slipped away. Reims, Chartres, Amiens. Today they stand grey against the sky, as though they never knew any other skin. And yet the evidence persists in remnants of pigment, specks tucked in pores, scratches where colour once lay thick. Restorations with laser light reveal saints once flush with life, angels once winged in fire, faces once painted against the sky. What was quiet was loud. What we call austere was once baroque. And so, when we walk inside today, we see silence but should imagine theatre. Every saint or demon looked back at worshippers with paint, thick enough to carry meaning more vividly than text. Doctrine hung in blue cloth and red robe. Miracles stood painted against plastered walls. Light caught on gilded figures to give force to ceremony. Congregations knelt and bowed within a complete system where vision itself lit their faith. The lesson is not small. Medieval faith was not grim and grey. It was drenched in colour. Cathedrals were not rock chambers of echo, but spectacles designed to shock and overwhelm. Sacred space was meant to stun, to surround. The so-called Dark Ages shone with brightness far harder to ignore than our muted memory suggests. In remembering this, we also recover what was lost. To imagine the colour freshly projected at Reims is not to invent, but to restore what stone once held. It reframes every step through nave and aisle. When you see stained glass burn with light, remember that once the walls and statues outside the glass burned too. Only centuries of rain and expense withdrew the paint. Without those layers, our eyes have been trained to think solemnity lay in stone alone. When you next walk into a cathedral, look closely. A faint fleck of red on a carved fold, a smudge of blue in a groove. These are not defects, but survivors of splendour. They are fragments from an era when worship was performed not in silence of vision, but in a rush of colour meant to strike soul through the eyes. If you strip away the myth of bare stone, what remains is closer to carnival than to frost. Worshippers were meant to feel drowned in it, to walk under painted ceilings as if stepping beneath the vault of heaven itself. That, for the medieval mind, was the truth of sacred space. That recognition leaves us with a choice, to keep seeing only stone, or to reimagine the riot of colour hidden beneath our modern view. To do the latter is to grant back some of the depth due to their vision, and to admit their world was less drab, more daring than ours has assumed. It also ties us back to the theme we've followed all along, that myths about the Middle Ages cloud our sight. What we think of as the plain and dull reality of their world was often vivid, symbolic, and alive with intention. To see the colours restored is to confront how different their worship and their imagination truly was, and once you accept that, it becomes easier to recognise how other stories, about monks in swamps or outlaws in green, also speak less of fantasy and more of deeper needs. In the fenlands of eastern England, where flat marshes stretched as far as the eye could see, medieval chroniclers told a story that seemed nothing short of miraculous. They said that Crowland Abbey had risen from the very waters, a house of God standing firm where only reeds, bogs and treacherous mud had been before. Pilgrims described it as divine proof. God had planted a monastery in a place no man could live. For centuries the tale was accepted as miracle. After all, anyone who walked those marshes knew how impossible it seemed. The ground shifted beneath each step, waterlogged and unstable. Entire wagons sank without warning, and villages were built only on rare islands of higher, drier ground. To raise a massive stone church in such conditions looked like magic. Yet when archaeologists began to study Crowland's remains, they uncovered evidence not of sorcery but of ingenious medieval engineering. The abbey's builders had solved the problem of unstable ground with a technique still admired today: piling. Hundreds of timber posts, cut from nearby forests, were driven deep into the peat and clay beneath the swamp. These piles created an artificial platform, distributing the weight of the stone walls across a broad base rather than allowing it to sink into the mire. Over these posts, builders laid layers of brushwood and gravel, forming a stable mat. Only then did they begin to raise stone. The method was slow, back-breaking and expensive, but it worked. To the casual eye, none of this was visible. All a visitor saw was a towering abbey, its walls reflecting on the still water of the fens appearing to float. To medieval pilgrims, the sight confirmed the miracle story. God had blessed the monks with a foundation stronger than earth itself. In truth, the monks had learned from centuries of local adaptation. People of the fens built houses on artificial mounds, dug drainage ditches, and laid woven reed mats under footpaths. The abbey simply expanded those same techniques on a monumental scale. Crowland's legend also reflected the broader medieval habit of weaving natural challenges into stories of divine triumph. Building in a swamp was not just a technical problem, it was a spiritual one. The wilderness was seen as hostile, a place of demons and danger. To plant an abbey, there was to claim it for God, to turn chaos into order. Chroniclers recorded the struggle in religious terms, but beneath the miracle was an early example of humans reshaping a hostile environment through sheer persistence. The abbey's survival across centuries testifies to the success of the method. Despite floods, invasions, and fires, its foundations held. When modern engineers studied the surviving structures, they marveled that medieval builders without advanced mathematics or modern tools had achieved such stability. The system of piling is still used in construction today for skyscrapers in soft ground, or bridges over marshes. What was once called miracle now reads as foresight, and yet the miracle story mattered. Pilgrims who travelled to Crowland didn't come only for architecture. They came because they believed the site itself was holy. Stories of saints, relics, and divine intervention drew them, and their donations kept the abbey thriving. For the monks, allowing visitors to see the abbey as miraculous was not deception, but devotion. They believed God had guided their ingenuity, that the piling and brushwood were themselves part of his providence. Faith and engineering were not separate realms, they were threads of the same tapestry. The swamp, too, became part of the abbey's identity. Chroniclers described the waters as transformed by holiness, once wild and treacherous, now home to a beacon of civilization. Fishermen, farmers, and travellers in the fenlands pointed to the abbey as proof that human settlement could endure even in the most unlikely places. The story grew with each telling. The abbey not only stood on swamp but conquered it, a triumph of heaven over earth. Modern historians recognise the practical truth beneath the tale. Crowland Abbey did not float by miracle. It stood because of careful design. But they also recognised the power of the myth. Without the miracle story, the abbey might have been just another example of medieval ingenuity. With it, it became a symbol, a place where faith and skill merged so tightly that no pilgrim could tell where one ended and the other began. This duality, miracle in words, engineering in reality, is what makes Crowland's story endure. It shows us that the Middle Ages were not a world of pure superstition, nor of cold rationality. They were a blend, where belief infused every achievement with meaning. To us, the piles of timber under stone are technical brilliance. To them, it was God's hand steadying their work. Both perspectives preserve the wonder, and both are true in their own way. So when you hear that Crowland Abbey rose from the waters, you can picture the monks hammering posts into the swamp, sweat running down their backs, hands blistered, their labour unseen by pilgrims who later marvelled at the finished work. You can also imagine those same pilgrims kneeling in awe, convinced that God had planted a church where only reeds had stood. One saw wood and stone, the other miracle and faith. Together, they built a story that still stands centuries later. Few medieval tales have captured the imagination as vividly as that of Robin Hood, the green-clad outlaw who robbed the rich to give to the poor. For centuries, audiences have pictured him lurking beneath the trees of Sherwood Forest, bow drawn, a merry band of followers at his side. In plays, ballads, and later films, he became a symbol of rebellion against tyranny, an almost mythical defender of justice. Yet, beneath the layers of legend, evidence suggests that Robin Hood was not simply invention. Somewhere in the tangled record of medieval England lies the shadow of a man, or perhaps several men, whose story gave rise to the outlaw we know today. The earliest references to Robin Hood appear not in elaborate romances but in legal and literary scraps from the late Middle Ages. Court rolls from the 13th and 14th centuries contain names like Robert Hod, Robin Hood, or Hobahod. These were often nicknames given to fugitives or criminals, suggesting that the name itself had already become shorthand for outlawry. In 1262, a court record from Yorkshire mentions a man called Robert Hod Fugitive, who may have been one of the first real figures behind the legend. A century later, chroniclers noted that Robin Hood was used almost generically, like a title for anyone living outside the law. But the leap from fugitive's name to folk hero wasn't made by courts, it was made by storytellers. The earliest ballads of Robin Hood, such as A Jest of Robin Hood, date to the 15th century. In these verses he is not yet the polished gentleman of later romances, but a rough outlaw, who nonetheless adheres to a strict code. He protects the poor, punishes corrupt officials, and reveres the Virgin Mary. Unlike noble knights of Arthurian lore, Robin is a figure of the common folk, his virtue measured not by chivalry, but by loyalty, generosity, and resistance to oppressive authority. The historical context matters. Medieval England was a land of heavy taxation, royal forests, and harsh penalties for poaching or resisting sheriffs. For peasants struggling under these laws, stories of a bold archer striking back resonated deeply. The outlaw became a vessel for collective frustration, transforming real grievances into entertainment. Even if the man himself remained elusive, the idea of Robin Hood expressed truths about medieval life. Some historians argue that fragments of multiple real men merged into the legend. Candidates have been proposed across centuries: a fugitive in Wakefield, a rebel in Barnesdale, or an outlaw who haunted Sherwood in the reign of Edward II. None can be definitively proven, yet the recurrence of similar names and details across time suggests that Robin was not invented from nothing. He may have been many men at once, their deeds woven together into a single character who outgrew them all. The church, too, left traces of his presence. By the 15th century, Robin Hood plays were being staged during festivals like May Day, with villagers dressing as the outlaw and his companions. These plays, often tolerated or even organised by church officials, show how deeply Robin had entered the cultural imagination. He was not condemned as a dangerous criminal, but embraced as a festive symbol of resistance and freedom. The transformation from outlaw to folk hero was already complete. Over time, the story continued to evolve. In the medieval ballads, Robin was a yeoman, a free but common man. Later retellings elevated him into a dispossessed nobleman, the Earl of Huntingdon, who fought against the villainy of Prince John. This shift reflected changing tastes. Audiences of the Renaissance and beyond preferred heroes of noble birth. But the core remained medieval, a man who lived in the forest, defied unjust sheriffs, and protected the weak. Modern research has even revealed how accurate some parts of the legend may be. Sherwood Forest, often romanticised as an endless greenwood, did indeed shelter outlaws, poachers, and rebels. Archaeological studies show that medieval forests were carefully regulated, with strict forest law that punished even the gathering of wood. To break those rules was to risk fines, imprisonment, or worse. For peasants, the forest could be both refuge and prison, a place where survival and resistance blurred. In that environment, it isn't hard to imagine an outlaw leader inspiring stories that carried far beyond his own life. What looked like a miracle was often craft, or the human body answering fear in strange ways. A pig on trial, a phantom pope, dancers who could not stop. Each story shows how the Middle Ages faced chaos with rules, ritual, and imagination. These stories are not meant to demystify everything, but to let you rest with the quiet knowledge that people of the past were clever, resourceful, and often more like us than the myths suggest. If you enjoyed this quiet uncovering, consider subscribing. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.